Has there ever been anyone with bigger boots to fill than Joshua did, taking over from Moses? Moses had called down the plagues on Egypt and squared off against the most powerful man in the world. He was the one who led Israel out of slavery and across the sea on dry ground. He was the one who'd spoken with God on the mountain and come down with his face still glowing from the encounter. He had brought them God's law and stood in the breach for them when they rebelled. When the nation fought against the Amalekites, they were victorious while Moses' arms were raised. Moses was a man with whom God would speak face to face as one talks to a friend. So it's not really surprising, is it, that when Joshua takes over, God speaks to him to reassure him. Now, though these words were given to Israel at a very specific time in their history, in a military situation that most of us struggle to relate to, they still, as we as a church look forward to the next 20 years, have power to reassure us. The first thing to acknowledge is our debt to the past. As Joshua took over the leadership of Israel, he must have been very conscious of everything that he owed to Moses. It was, as we heard, through Moses that the law had come. It was through Moses' desperate intercession that God preserved the nation when he would have been within his rights to wipe them out. It was under Moses that the nation and its structures and its patterns of life, both secular and religious, had been formed. Joshua even owed his name to Moses. It's a little fact that's easy to miss, but he used to be called Hoshea. You can look it up in Numbers 13, verse 16. Moses named him Joshua. And Joshua had been groomed for leadership for decades. He'd served under Moses and alongside him. Starting as his aide or his assistant, like he's described here, he'd grown into an important military, spiritual, and social leader. Joshua had become the man he was because of Moses. And if you go through Exodus and read Exodus and Numbers and Deuteronomy again, not so much Leviticus because that doesn't have as much of the story in, but you see the access that Joshua had. It was really like Moses was just preparing him for leadership. Joshua was there with Moses in the tent of meeting. It's just wonderful. And you think there's kind of a joke to be made somewhere about the giants that were in the land and the shoulders of the giant that Joshua was standing on looking into it. And in this world that is so obsessed with youth and with each new generation trying to find ways to criticize those who've gone before for the mistakes that they've made, and perhaps that's just a way to excuse their own failings, it's important for God's people to be different, isn't it? And acknowledge our debt to the past. I'm not saying we can't, whether it's about colonialism or the abuse of women, or I'm not saying we can't ask those questions, but we have to acknowledge our debt to the past. The world tempts us to think that we're here by our own strength because we're so great. And we can come up with a narrative of how brilliant and pioneering we are. But we're all standing on the shoulders of giants. We're part of a long chain of faithful men and women that stretches back in time. Now, this fellowship in Ulverston alone could name the churches and individuals who served and preached and gave up their money and their time to help out on mission events and knocking this building into shape, and a million other little jobs. But we could go back even further still, couldn't we? A Reformed Baptist mission was started here because of confessional traditions within British Christianity that were worked out carefully and often through persecution hundreds of years before. And those confessional traditions were informed by revolutions that came decades before that and decades before that. And those events were informed by events, centuries before that. And you just end up going backwards and backwards through time. Each generation, for all the mistakes they've made, is indebted to the generation that's gone before. That's why a little knowledge of church history, especially, is a wonderful and important thing, because it helps us see our debt to the past by seeing the extraordinary and ordinary people that God has used all over the world to get us to where we are. There's been an awful lot of blood, sweat, toil, and tears to get us here today. It's right to acknowledge that and thank the sovereign Lord of history for making us who we are and putting us where we are at such a time as this. Like Joshua, whatever we're facing ahead, we have to see our debt to the past. But now let's think about our duty to the future. Because as God points out quite matter-of-factly in verse 2, Moses, my servant, is dead. We're to keep one eye on the past. We're not meant to live there. God's got work for us to do now. Well, for Joshua, he was to lead the nation of Israel into the promised land. He was to lead their armies under God. God made great promises. We'll see a bit of that in our next point. But God gives clear commands repeatedly. So Joshua can't be in any doubt as to what he's to do or how he's to do it. What's he to do? He's to cross the Jordan. He's to be strong and courageous. He's to lead the people. The manner in which he's to do all of that is obedient to all the laws God's servant Moses gave him. Now we have that in mind, maybe, that just means the law of Moses, that, the hundreds of rules that you get in Leviticus and Numbers, Deuteronomy, about dietary requirements and sacrifices and the festivals and all that. But it's actually a much broader idea when he says to keep everything in the law. It means all of the teachings, all the practical wisdom. Joshua, he says, every lesson you learn under Moses, you're to embody that. And that includes keeping the written law, because that's mentioned specifically, isn't it? That's why Joshua is constantly to repeat the book of the law. He's meant to meditate on it. He's meant to internalize it. In fact, I think it's in Deuteronomy, isn't it, when it talks about the king that Israel is to have, like an ideal view of king is a king who writes out the Bible by hand and knows it. And that's worth noting, isn't it? The biblical pattern for leadership is biblical leadership. Leadership by the book. Leadership that is characterized by a knowledge and love of God's word. Leadership patterned after it. We need leaders who know the word and live it out. And that's the chief thing, isn't it? Joshua's duty, his duty to the future, was first and foremost obedience. God tells him to do stuff. Here's all this stuff that you're to do, Joshua. And so he better make sure he does it. It had been disobedience that kept Israel out of the land before. God said, go in and take it. And they said, oh, no, we're a bit scared. And that's something wonderful here. As Joshua looks back on Moses' life and he looks forward into Canaan, he can reflect how Moses' death is a concluding act of judgment on the generation who fell in the wilderness. It's like a bookend event or sort of a full stop event. Terrifying as it must have been to lose Moses, God is offering Israel a new opportunity. It's kind of like a fresh start, isn't it? It's the opportunity to obey. An opportunity to learn what was good from the generation that went before, but to go in a better direction. They can be strong and courageous, where the generation before quaked in their boots and didn't dare go into the land, no matter what God had said. And this is what we too need to bear in mind. We have a duty to the future. We have things which the Lord Jesus Christ has commanded his church to do. And so if we want to be a faithful church, we better make sure that we do those things. We're to preach the gospel. We are to make and baptize disciples. We are to love God and others. But in a hostile world, because that doesn't maybe sound so bad. It's like we don't have to go and fight giants. You don't have to go, charge at a fortified city in the ancient Near East, do you? It's like go and talk to people about Jesus. Love them. Immerse them in water when they confess their faith. That doesn't sound so difficult, but we know that in this hostile world, that's a frightening thing to do. And we know people will throw it back in our faces. And they'll swear at us. And they might shout at us. Or slam doors in our faces. Or fall out with us. And British people seem terrified of conflict and losing the respect of their peers. Almost more than someone serving them a cup of tea that hasn't properly been boiled. But remember, courage doesn't mean not being afraid. Courage means acting boldly in the face of fear. God says, do not be afraid, but that's not like he's going to tell you off if you are. He's saying, don't be afraid. Act in spite of that fear. I will take away the causes of the fear. We can make, it's our habit to complicate things, isn't it? We can make Christianity as complicated as we like. And we could come up with a really complicated plan or a mission for the next 20 years. We could say we're going to do this, and this will lead to that, and that will lead to that. And we could come up with a really complicated scheme. But when we get down to it, we, like Joshua, are called to obey. That's it. That's our duty to the future. Obey Jesus. Full stop. But there's something missing from all this, isn't there? Now, we've thought about our debt to the past. We've looked with a bit of trepidation at our duty to the future. But we've not really thought about our hope of success. So let's do that now. Our hope of success. Because this is where this passage in Joshua becomes so very helpful when you start to kind of take it apart a bit and look at the pieces. Think of who Joshua was. I said he had big boots to fill, but Joshua was quite an impressive man. He had done his training, like we saw, under Moses. And as we saw, he had the most privileged access to some amazing things. In fact, you're not quite sure, but it seems at times when it's like Moses goes on his own to meet with God, Joshua might have been there with him. So you can see that the ways in which Joshua was every bit as privileged and every bit as equipped and every bit as filled with the Holy Spirit as Moses was. He also had close access to Caleb and Aaron and the other bright and best of Israel. So Joshua, he went to a good seminary, we can put it that way. And by temperament, Joshua seems to have been exactly the kind of person to lead Israel and their armies in a war of conquest. He was a get up and go, we can do it kind of guy. Of the spies that went into Canaan, remember, he was one of two who came back and said, yeah, it's scary, but we can do it. God's with us. We can do it. Let's go. He seems to have been strong and courageous by character. But does that describe all of us? Doesn't, does it? Some of us are timorous and shy. Many of us, and it's kind of typically the way it goes in church life, that you get sort of, charismatic churches, they're more extroverted. You get your Reformed Baptistic churches, we're more introverted. We just kind of attract that personality type. And as I said before, those of us who are British at least, we don't like conflict. Many of us haven't had any kind of formal theological training. We've not had training in church planting or disciple making. Some of us don't know our Bibles very well, or we've just not had a very good education. And so if we're comparing ourselves to Joshua, who studied at the feet of Moses, we don't think about comparing ourselves to Moses. That's just like way beyond, don't we? But whatever comparison we like to make, we come up woefully inadequate. And so we will feel singularly unqualified to obey the duty that God has entrusted to us. We're just like, I just can't do it. However brave I can try and make myself, I'm not capable. I'm not qualified. But here's where I want to encourage us. Because in this passage, when God is commanding Joshua as the leader of Israel to get up and cross the Jordan, what's the encouragement God gives him that he'll meet with success? Because God tells him, you will meet with success. I'm going to give you this land. I told your ancestors, I told Abraham they would get this land, so I'm going to give you this land. So they're going to meet with success. What is the encouragement that God gives him that will get them there? Is it Joshua's long years of training under Moses? Because that would be good to have under your belt, wouldn't it? Is he told how Moses has modelled for him the precise pattern and style of leadership that he can emulate? It's just copy everything Moses did. Is it the guerrilla tactics that the Israelites have perfected through decades of nomadic battle? And you think that's going to set them up, because when you're fighting a superior army, well, if you're good at hit and run kind of strikes, that's the way to make use of your limited experience. Now, is it even in the strength and courage that Joshua is commanded to manifest? As he told, if you are strong and courageous, and if you can just be quite strong and courageous enough, then you'll be successful. Because it's not in any of those things, is it? Good as they all are, and God-given gifts as all of those things might be. If he's obedient and does what God has commanded, he'll meet with success in his doing of it, because God will be with him. That's what makes the difference, isn't it? Now, we've got to understand this, because when God says, I will be with you, that's the kind of thing we say, like, oh, God go with you, God be with you. And it's just a nice thing to say. It's a pleasant way of saying goodbye. In fact, goodbye means God be with you. Did you know that? I've told you this before, so you probably did. God be with you, and he contracted it to goodbye. So every time you say goodbye, you're saying God be with you. It's something that sounds nice, but do we really mean it? But when God says it, he means, I will be with you. Because God doesn't lie. He's not a man that he should lie, or the son of man that he should lie. So when he says, I will be with you, he, the creator God of the universe, means that he will be personally present in the camp. He'll be in the army. He will be there in the land that they've come to occupy. He says it in verse 9, do not be afraid. Why? Do not be discouraged. Why? It's frightening. It's discouraging. For the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. You march around the walls of Jericho and knock on that door. God is with you. You stand on one side of the Jordan wondering how you are going to get over without getting your feet wet. God will be with you. You're facing those giants and those armies and those chariots. and God is with you. Now, we are afraid as Christians, and we are discouraged in this world we live in, because we think we are outnumbered and outgunned. And I think we have believed a lie that the devil has told us. We feel perhaps because we're not exactly like the people who've blazed the trail ahead of us, and we can see all the ways in which we're just not quite cut from the same cloth, that we can't meet success. And I've said this before, I'll say it again because I think it's helpful. That is the danger of Christian biography, isn't it? Because we read about our heroes of the faith outside of the Bible, these Puritans who get up in the middle of the night and write big books of theology, and they would pray so hard or for so long on like oak floors that they'd wear a hole in it. And we're like, I don't do that. I can't do what they did. I'm just like a little mouse, and they're this giant or hero of the faith. And I want us to hear those words. Open his eyes, Lord, so that he may see. Think of David and Goliath. And how many times have you heard that story? And maybe not in good churches. I think good churches preach it better than that. But maybe you've heard it in the culture. And they say, it was a real David and Goliath. And they mean some plucky little lawyer has taken down a big company or something. And we preach it as if, if God is with you, you can go and take on a giant and you can win. And you can face down demons, and you might only be a plucky little lad, but you'll pick some stones and you'll throw them and you'll be good. You'll be fine. You can take on the giants. And the fact we forget when we tell that story is that David was the anointed of God. Because we can put too much on ourselves, can't we? And be like, if you only have the courage, and perhaps you only have the training, because David, he trained. He was good with a sling because he was out in the mountains killing lions and bears to defend his father's sheep. And he just had guts. The boy had chutzpah. And we're like, but I'm just not like that. In a way, it's good. You don't need to be. You don't need to be David. We've got a David. You don't need to be the anointed of God. We've got an anointed. We've got a king. You don't need to be the king. You're not called to be the king. You might not be able to take out Goliath on your own, but you don't need to be the one who takes on Goliath. We've got someone to fight our fight for us. The word says, greater is he who is in me than he who is in the world. Now, yes, the work is more than we can do. But we don't do it on our own. All we're called to do is obedience. All we're called to do is obey. It's God who gives the victory. Our hope of success is not in what we can do, but in the God who is with us. And that isn't a hollow thing, is it? When he says, I will be with you. When 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I am in the midst of them. There is one who walks among the candlesticks. There's an old Russian proverb, you probably know it. It says, look to the past, be blind in one eye. Forget the past, be blind in both eyes. We need to realize our debt to the past and see how God works through men and women, great and small, to bless every generation of his people. But we mustn't become so blinded by that we forget our duty to the future. Moses, my servant, is dead. Now then, you and all these people. Now I was texting Steve, our former pastor, Steve Wood, and he suggested this passage in the first place because he preached on it on the Sunday 20 years ago. And he said this: Moses had done the work I had for him. Now you are to get on with the task I have for you. His work of building his church continues like a juggernaut that cannot be stopped. The work goes on. It's just the staff that is changed. We, with the characteristics, the temperaments, the skills and backgrounds God has given us, or hasn't given us, we need to serve bravely and obediently now. Because our hope for the future isn't in our own strength, but it's in our Joshua. It's in Jesus. He's our David. He's our Joshua. We might not be strong and courageous at times. We might not be ready to go and charge down a Philistine giant. But he is. He's already beaten the biggest enemy we face. He will beat everything else. And he is with us always. Yes, even to the very end of the age. What are we worried about for the next 20 years if he is with us? Church, remember where we've come from. Remember where we're going. And remember who it is who walks with us. Let's sing our final hymn on Jordan.